We talk about Novel Nest. We showcase Warhead. And the question everybody's asking in the comments, am I Brendan Fraser? All that on this week's Indie Author Showcase. Welcome to the Indie Author Showcase, the podcast by indie authors for indie authors. I am your host, multi-award winning author Chad Robert Morgan, and let's get started. First, let's go into our newest reoccurring segment, Am I Brendan Fraser? Handing it over to Brendan Fraser Watch.
Brendan Fraser Watch.
No, I'm still not Brendan Fraser.
This has been Brendan Fraser Watch.
All right, thank you very much, Brendan Fraser Watch. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is this new app coming out called novelnest.app. If you go to novelnest.app in your web browser, you'll go right to there. Currently, it is set to launch around May 10th. I had a quick talk with the developer. He said basically they're doing a Founding Authors Day on May 10th. That's a tentative date. They have, as of right now, somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 people signed up for this app, waiting for it to launch, and over 800 books submitted. What this app is supposed to be is kind of like Tinder for indie authors. Okay, wait, no, that's not a good example. What this is supposed to do is it's supposed to match the reader with the indie books. In other words, it's supposed to look at your profile, compare that to what people have added about the books, and try to make a more intelligent match than, like, say, Amazon does, where it basically just says, oh, okay, you liked a horror book, here are some other horror books. Right now, it is completely free. It's completely free as an indie author to put your book onto the site. Remember, you're not actually putting your book on the site, you're just putting your information on the book. You're not giving your book away for free, you're just letting people know where they can find it, such as on Amazon. If you are a fan of indie authors, if you're a reader, as of right now, it doesn't cost you anything to sign up. The app isn't live yet, from my understanding. Again, he's got, the developer stated he has about 300 to 350 people on standby on the wait list waiting for this thing to launch next month. But when it goes, you should be able to find books that are better suited to your flavor and your style of reading and your favorite genre. So give Novel Nest a shot. Again, right now it's free. I did ask him about monetization, and right now he's just focused on getting the app to work. He does have some plans for monetization later, but as he stated, there will not be a pay to play for authors. There might be some ways to monetize in terms of advertising or some other kind of premium service, but just getting your book listed so readers can find it should always be free, if I'm understanding the developer correctly. So go over to novelnest.app and give it a shot. If you're an author, try putting your book into his catalog so new readers can find you. If you are a fan of indie authors and want to find your next favorite author, sign up for Novel Nest, and in about 3 weeks, you might be able to find a few new people. So give that a shot. In terms of the world of the indie author, things are a bit slow now. Nothing major has happened this week. Again, as a reminder, at the end of May is going to be Monsterpalooza. May is also when signups for the OC Book Fair is going to happen. This will be the third year they're doing the OC Book Fair. I heard last year did rather well. I actually applied for last year and never heard back. Although a friend of the show, Frontline Comics, I believe, was at OC Book Fair. Again, if you are an indie author, especially if you're kind of local, if you're in the OC area, you might want to check out the OC Book Fair starting in May and see if you can't get yourself signed up for that. Other than that, there's not really anything major in indie author news that I have heard. So we'll keep this podcast a little on the short side, and we'll go straight to this month's review. Or I keep saying review. We don't do reviews. This is a showcase. I wanted to show off an indie author. I'm not reviewing an indie author. We've talked about this before. Why I don't do reviews is, first of all, reviews are very subjective. Okay. I have reviews on my book that run the gambit. Some people, oh, this book was really good, and it's still like a 3. I'm like, if it was really good, why are you only giving it a 3? Some people dig this book and they give it a 5. Other people give it a 3. I mean, it's the same book. So, if you are reading something that is more your flavor, you're going to give it a higher rating because it's going to be more of what you want. So, like last week, I did a dark romance book, which was for me a little difficult to get through because I'm not really a fan of male on male spicy scenes, to put it in a way that doesn't get me demonetized. But I still want to be fair to other genres, even though it's not a genre I particularly care for. And again, it wasn't that it was badly written or it's a bad book. It's just covering a subject that I don't particularly enjoy. I don't think two guys going down on each other is particularly something I want to read about. But that's a personal taste, right? And that's fine. There are people that look at some of my horror books and say, oh, I can't handle that. It's too scary, or it's too gross, or it's taken on a subject that I think is a little too... Again, I don't take offense to that. That's fine. That's why I try to put it on the cover, right? I joke, my book, The Baby Eater, they're like, The Baby Eater? I was like, we don't do subtle. It is right. This is one of the few times you can judge the book by its cover. It is right there. So I want people to be comfortable with what they're purchasing. Okay? If they're not into, really raunchy, porky style comedy, they don't want to read ISF. If they're not into, visceral monster horror where infants are on the menu, you don't want to read The Baby Eater. But I want you to know that going into it. And if that's not your style, I'm fine with that, right? There isn't going to be... I think if you did do a one-size-fits-all kind of book, it would just appease nobody, right? So going back to last week's review, when we're talking about Feral MMMF, I don't want to disclude that book from the podcast because it's not my style and not my flavor. Because it may not be mine, but it might be yours. And I want you to know what this author's doing, and I want you to know what this book is like, because if it sounds interesting to you, I want you to check it out. But that makes reviewing it hard, because it's not my flavor. I'm not an expert in that type of... So I don't want to give it like a 4-star, 5-star rating, because, my personal biases is going to sneak into the review. So, and I know I've had this conversation like 5 times since doing this podcast. That's why we don't do reviews. We do showcases. I am showing you an author that I think is good. It may not necessarily be an author that I enjoy. But that doesn't mean they're bad, right? It just means it's not my style. And that's fine. And we've interviewed authors on the show that might not be in my wheelhouse, that are great authors. Cynthia Diamond, Jennifer Milne. I mean, they write books that aren't really on the top of my list to go get because it's not my flavor, but they're good books. And they're good authors. So they deserve to get showcased. And that's the philosophy of the podcast. We want to show off who I think are good authors, not necessarily books Chad likes, is the point. So again, that's why there's showcases, not reviews. And I got to get out of the habit of saying reviews, because they're not really reviews. I do actually leave 5-star reviews on every book that we showcase on Amazon when I can find them on Amazon. Sometimes we do things like comics and they're not up on Amazon, that kind of thing. And I do have a backlog, actually. I don't think I've done a review since like December. So I do have a backlog. Anybody that's had their book showcased since around mid-December last year, it's a backlog. I got maybe about 8 or 10 reviews I got to write and get up onto Amazon and Goodreads. So yeah, if your book has been showcased recently, I owe you one. I'll get to it. I have not forgotten you. So with that said, for like probably the 5th time, let's go to this week's showcase. Not a review, showcase. And we're looking at the graphic novel, the first issue of Warhead. Now, one thing I like about indie comics is it's really easy to read. When you're trying to do a book a week for the podcast, and you're already working like 2 jobs, plus trying to be a writer, plus trying to make merch for conventions and everything like that, you have no spare time. So being able to get through a graphic novel like this really helps. And in fact, we actually do quite a few comics and graphic novels on the podcast. And so at the end of the year, we usually do a best of, and I usually do a separate category for comics than I do for books, because I will have so many graphic novels and comics reviewed that there's usually enough to do a whole category by itself. Plus, it is a little bit of an unfair comparison, because comics are definitely a different animal than books. This is probably the first comic or graphic novel I've done this year. So just a review, the basic caveat is the problem with doing comics or graphic novels is usually this is a slice of the story. So, and this is typical, right? Because this is going to run on for several issues. I think there's about 4 issues of it. This is actually a collection of the first 6 issues of the comic, I believe. So that too makes it a little bit challenging. Like, for example, when I did Mask of Halaya, they only had individual comics. I did like something like the first 3 or 4. Later, they actually published the first like 5 issues in a graphic novel, and that was just issue 1. So it becomes difficult to recommend the story because you don't necessarily know where it's going. Right? I mean, to be the equivalent of you're getting a book from, say, Scott Harper or from Michael Robinson, and you read the first 4 chapters or 5 chapters, and then you have to make a recommendation on the book. It's unfair, right? Which is again why we don't do or reviews. We just are showcasing. So, but that's always a challenge with comics. With other comics, like if they're individual issues, I'll actually read several issues typically, because again, trying to make a fair apples to apples comparison, this book is 6 individual issues. If I just did 1 issue of some other comic, then they're at even more of a disadvantage because it's even a smaller sliver of the overall story. So trying to do this in a fair and unbiased manner is a little bit of a challenge. With that said, this is the first 6 issues, and so we are definitely getting a good vibe as to the style. Everything's illustrated in black and white. There's a very surreal feel to the storyline. So there's an offhanded comment somewhere about when people used to be human. Everybody here has got some weird head. Like the this guy's friends, one of them is he's like a cockroach head. Another one is like an axe. Another one's like 3 prongs that go into a light socket. There was one guy that had a deck of cards. Another one that's a bird. So something happened in this universe that mutated the populace in very strange ways. And our main character, Adam, he has a head that is a acid green atom bomb. And it does seem to spew some kind of gunk or acid if he gets upset. There is a part of the book where he's being assaulted, and I guess it's part of a fight or flight response. Just kind of, and he's like, ah, the bad guy's, ah, kind of thing. So, the main crux of the book, and I'll just read it from the back here. It says, Adam is an American graffiti artist living in London who has a giant acid green atomic bomb for a head. If he doesn't get his shit together, the world ends. So, this is putting a lot of stakes on what is a very typical human drama, which is trying to get your life in order, especially when you are like in your 20s kind of thing. I was joking about that. My son is graduating high school and is already packing his bags, getting ready to move out of the house. And when I talk to other people of various ages, we kind of get a similar reaction. It's like, yeah, when you're that age, you got everything figured out, right? You're 18, you know everything, even though you've never had a job, even though you still have to go to college and, prepare for a career. You know what you're doing because you're 18 and everything like that. And then when you hit like 20, you have that cognitive dissonance of realizing, oh shit, I actually don't know anything. And you have this very surreal thing where everything that you had figured out like 2 years ago is now like a chaotic mess. And that kind of happens somewhere in your 20s, right? It doesn't necessarily hit right at 20, but as you're getting closer to 30, if you hadn't hit it in your early 20s, you're realizing that people are excelling faster than you because you are still like, that job at McDonald's might have been paying the bills when you're 20, but now that you're hitting 30 and you're like, I'm still here flipping burgers, that kind of thing. Trust me, I've been there, right? In your 30s is usually when you kind of figure your shit out, right? And again, these are general, some people do it earlier, some people do it later, but in your 30s is usually where you hit your stride, right? You don't necessarily figure everything out, but you get a good rhythm going, right? You realize that you figured out basically about as much as you're ever going to figure out. And you just get into the groove. And by the time you're 40s, now you're on the other side of that where you're like, okay, I had everything figured out, but now we're getting to towards the end of things, and like, how do I prepare for my next stage of life where mom and dad are getting older and need care, where I now have grandkids, or how am I going to afford retirement? And then past that is your 50s, and I'm still trying to figure my 50s out, so I'll let you know in about 6 years how my 50s went, okay? That to me is a typical human experience, right? You're cocksure of everything in your teens, 20s. That cocksureness hits reality. And it's a big clusterfuck as, your hardcore set ways of how the universe is supposed to work collides with how the universe really works. And by the time you get into your 30s, you resolve those conflicts. And then in the 40s, you're coasting as you're working on your next stage. So the character in this book is definitely late teens, early 20s, and he's in that mode where his life isn't making sense right now, and he's trying to get it together. There is drug use in the book. I get the feeling that he's trying to bury his own kind of pain and issues that way. And again, there's also a lot of kind of dream sequences, kind of not dream sequences as like with Aliens where he wakes up and you realize it was all a dream, but just kind of like very reminiscent of Pink Floyd's The Wall, where things were very artistic and metaphorical. He meets a girl, and then in his mind, the girl is like coming up from a seashell or some stupid thing like that, that kind of thing. That didn't actually happen in the book, but something like that. So it's very artistic and surreal and abstract at times. Everybody's walking around with a meat cleaver for a head or something like that. The artist is trying to say something, I think. It's definitely worth checking out. It is, again, not a straightforward story. Well, actually, the story is a little more straightforward, I think. It is really about a guy trying to figure out his teens. It's like Pink Floyd's The Wall meets Euphoria. Really, truly is. If you're in that age bracket, maybe it might resonate a little bit more for you than it did for me. But I remember my 20s. I remember trying to deal with life and all that kind of stuff. And it's worth a look. It's definitely an interesting approach to telling a story. And I think it's worth checking out. So, yeah. So check out Warhead Volume 1. Katrina Kaj E. Kuntzman, if I read that right. So give that a shot. Okay, we're going to keep this podcast episode really short. Again, not a lot going on. Just a recap. Still not Brendan Fraser. Check out Novel Nest. Check out Warhead. And I'll see you at Monsterpalooza at the end of May. That's about it. That's all that's going on this week, guys. So until then, we'll see you next week and keep on reading.